addition to everything that was his life at this point, he also was believed to have had hydrocephalus. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it's basically water on the brain. This can happen at birth, which causes urinary tract problems later in life. And for him particularly, this means wetting the bed into his late adolescence, and later the inability to get hard. The scientific way to read it is almost weirder than me just saying that. But he was still able to, like, ejaculate. Anyway, prior to his birth, he had an older brother, supposedly named Stefan, and at the age of 4, Stefan had been kidnapped and cannibalized by his starving neighbors. And that's a pretty heavy story to tell your child, but this has actually never been established whether or not that had occurred, or if Stefan ever really existed either. So either Andrei made that up, or his mother made that up, or it's true, which is terrible as well. So anyway, so his home life was not great, and it was disrupted by his father soon being drafted by the Soviet Union during the Second World War to fight against Germany in the Red Army. So between 1941 and 44, Andrei had witnessed a lot of the effects of Nazi occupation of Ukraine, which he described as horrific, adding in that he'd witnessed bombings, fires, and shootings from which he and his mother would hide in cellars and ditches. On one occasion, him and his mother were forced to watch their own hut burn to the ground. With his father at war, Andrei and his mother shared a single bed. And I mean, he was a chronic bedwetter, as I kind of mentioned earlier, so she would berate him, make fun of him, make him feel very uncomfortable about that for every time he had wet the bed. And while his father was serving, his mother had actually became pregnant with Andrei's younger sister. Now it's believed that she became pregnant by being raped by a German soldier, and that since they only lived in a one-room hut, Andrei would have witnessed this. That is, however, just something people have theorized. Meanwhile, his father, who was serving in the war, was captured, held prisoner, wounded, and then vilified by his countrymen for allowing himself to be captured. And when he finally returned home, Andrei had been heavily bullied because of his father's cowardice, saying a lot of the time that he was, the same. I didn't realize being captured made you a bad person. I assume the alternative that they would have preferred is death. And Andrei really felt the effects of this at school. But he also was heavily bullied for other reasons. He became painfully shy, as people would often taunt him for his swollen belly because he was hungry. He was made fun of for how small he was, how timid he was, and they would even tease him because he would faint in class due to hunger. Just shows you how terrible kids are. That is so awful. They can be very cruel, but at the same time, I mean, I'm sure these children were all going through a lot, so, I mean, I don't know, that's pretty sad. So, he didn't really have a safe place. Home wasn't safe, school wasn't, and although his father was apparently very kind, his mother would berate him, would bully him. It's very harsh and unforgiving. They really didn't have a was smart in his subjects, but he really couldn't maintain discipline in the classroom, and he was regularly bullied by his own students who had taken advantage of his modest nature. And it was in May of 1973 that his first of many sexual assaults was committed with one of his pupils. And when I first read this, by the way, it sounds like he's in a pool. I cannot confirm, but the exact wording says Andrei had swam towards a 15-year-old student of his, groping her, and he'd released himself based on the struggle of her trying to escape. Later, he'd assaulted another student of his, whom was locked in his classroom, and both of which incidents he was never in trouble for. And nor was he in trouble for an occasion in which other teachers saw him touching himself while students were there, which is quite bizarre. In fact, one of his duties was to ensure students who were boarded there, who were staying there, were present in their dormitories in the evenings, and he would often go into the dormitories and open the door quickly, hoping he would see some of the girls undressed, which is, I know. But thankfully, after a string of complaints about indecent assaults on young children had started to come forward, he was forced to move from school to school, losing some jobs due to cutbacks, some because he was a pedophile, but soon he'd settled down at a mining school near Rostov. His teaching career, however, did end in March of 1981 after several child molestation complaints against males and females that came forward. In the same month, he began a job as a supply clerk for a factory that produced was such a big insecurity and thing for him that now he'd found this outlet that soon would be, oh, I mean, you'll see. You will see. It gets very messed up very quickly here. And especially because he had to travel a lot for work, going on business trips, that type of thing. He had a lot of opportunities at his fingertips. But he did try to resist. He found it very overwhelming, and he would struggle resisting by cutting off business trips early to go home because it was too easy for him, just pretty messed up and gross. So perhaps it was the close brush with the law, but there was no more documented victims for 3 years. Still dodged by claims of child abuse, though. He found it really hard to get a job as a teacher, so he'd worked as a clerk for the raw materials factory. So he had access to a wide range of victims, and soon his next victim was found, 17-year-old Larissa, on September 3rd, 1981, the same as his previous victim. as the evidence of their samples were AB, and samples of identical gray hair was also retrieved. So when a further 15 victims were added by 1984, police efforts increased drastically, and they'd mounted massive surveillance operations over all transportation hubs. And Andrei, at one point, was actually arrested for suspicious behavior at a bus stop, but had avoided capture because the blood type was not a match. However, he was imprisoned for 3 months for minor conviction offenses. What was realized at the time is that Andrei's blood type, A, was different than the type found in his other fluids, which was AB. And as he was a member of a minority group known as non-secretors, whose blood type cannot be interfered by anything other than a blood sample. Which is interesting. So basically, police only had a sample of the semen, not the blood from the crime scenes, which made it so they didn't match. So he was able to escape murder suspicion for a little bit. And today's sophisticated DNA techniques avoid this now, but not back in the day. So he's in for minor charges. Nothing else, and soon gets out. Following his release, he's found working as a traveling buyer for a train company, and he managed to keep a low profile until August of 1985, when he had murdered 2 women in separate incidents. At around the time of the murders, the detectives were very frustrated at their lack of progress and engaged the help of psychiatrist Alexander. His last name is a lot for me. Bukhanovsky, who refined the profile of the killer. He had described the killer as a necrosadist, or someone who achieves sexual gratification from the suffering and death of others. He had also placed his age between 45 and 50, which is significantly older than what detectives were kind of basing their imagination off of, essentially, and everything else prior. The detectives were so desperate to catch this killer that they'd even had interviews with another serial killer, Anatoly Slivko, before he was executed, in an attempt to get any insight that they could. So coinciding with his attempt to understand the mind of a killer, attacks seemed to dry up, and police suspected that either their target stopped killing, maybe he died himself, or been incarcerated for other crimes. However, in 1988, he'd resumed his killing, the majority, however, away from the Rostov area, and his victims were no longer taken from public transportation outlets, as the police surveillance in this area continued, and Andrei knew what they were trying to do. So the body count rised, and a further 19 victims were found, and it appeared now that the killer was now taking increasingly more risks, focusing primarily on younger boys, killing in public areas where detection was much higher. Maybe it was an added rush, who really knows? The recently unfettered media of Gorbachev's Glasnost Society had placed enormous public pressure on police forces to catch the killer, and general police patrols were stepped up, with detectives targeting areas likely with uncovered with detectives filling all areas really with undercover wasn't there for the police. He wasn't even there for Andrei. He was just there for science. And Andrei was very flattered by this, and he'd opened up to the psychiatrist's approach and ended up confessing to everything, and even provided extensive details of all of his killings, and even leading police to sites of where the bodies were previously undiscovered. As well, they'd had a gymnasium filled with a bunch of different dummies. You can watch clips online where he would reenact everything that he had done to these poor victims. He had claimed to have had over 56 victims, but only 53 were confirmed. And I think that's so wild that, you know, though 53 were verified, they're like, yeah, he might be lying. 53 is still insane, so I don't know. So the figure was far in excess of the 36 cases the police had attributed to this man. So I'm sure they were all stunned at the actual body counts, very high. So he was declared fit to stand trial, and it went to court on April 14th of 1992. Throughout trial, he was held in an iron cage designed to keep him apart from his relatives, from the relatives of many of the victims who were there. And he was referred to in the media as the maniac, as his behavior in court had like two ranges. One, he was super bored, uninterested, and the other, he was loudly singing, talking gibberish, screaming. At one point, he even was reported to have dropped his pants and waved his parts at the crowd. So, the judge appeared less than impartial, often overruling Andrei's defense lawyers, and it was clear that his guilt was a foregone conclusion. The trial lasted until August, and surprisingly, even with the judge's bias, the verdict wasn't announced until 2 months later, on October 15th, where he was guilty of 52 of the 53 murder charges. He was then sentenced to death for each of the murders. So his entire appeal was centered around the claim that the psychiatric evaluation had found him witnessed to stand on trial was biased, but it was unsuccessful. 16 months later, he was executed by a shot to the back of the head on February 14th, 1994, which isn't a form of execution I really knew they rolled out, especially in the 90s. So Andrei had died February 14th, and the psychiatrist who had been a really big part in his capture went on to become a celebrated expert on sexual disorders and serial killers.